light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Each year I put together an inspirational calendar of different photos, and I tried to think of a caption for each one that is something, frequently a metaphor that can be applied to a lot of different things. Something that you can think about for an entire month and look at this picture for an entire month and still get something out of it to apply to your own life. I want this calendar to specifically be an empowering tool of service, not just a nice calendar to hang on the wall and forget about. And because of that, I'm doing at least 13 new photographs each year, which at this point means I now have over 200 photographs that I've done with captions and different, using the different calendars over the years. One of those has the witticism that there is always more to something than what you see. There is always more than can be seen. A close corollary to that is to insist that what is seen is always affected by what is unseen. Two different photos I have in all my calendars, in the photos that are now on my website. In all of that, I guess I'm encouraging people to be more aware of the part that is not seen. That when you look at something, you think you know what it is until you hear the greater story. It seems to me in the movie The Da Vinci Code, Tom Hanks points this out while playing a college professor in showing people a close-up of something and asking them what it is. And of course everyone guesses and everyone is wrong. And he zooms out to show what it is so that it's a tiny piece of a much larger picture. And then it's like, oh, that's what it is. And it's something completely different. In a similar way, in my calendar, I made a little boat that was out of styrofoam with a little sail on it, insisting that what is seen is always affected by that which is not seen. And I have Sister Who blowing on the sail of this boat to blow it across the tub of water that is placed in which it's placed. And you can't see my breath, but it still affects the boat moving across the water. In a similar sort of way, one of my favorite TV shows in the past, a number of years ago, was called The Ghost Whisperer. And the thing I loved about the writing of the show was how many times the story would reverse. You'd see this scary sort of manifestation in the beginning and try to guess what happened and why this person was, according to their ideology, trapped in this place in time and space, and that they couldn't leave that space and time until they resolved whatever it was that created their death. And this one woman who was the star of the show was the only one who could see the ghost and talk to them and figure out what it was that they needed to understand or what it was that needed to be rectified before they could, quote, move on or go to some higher dimension or something. The fascinating thing about each show was the number of times the plot would reverse. First she thought it was this, and then she learned some piece of information that said it wasn't that, it was this. And then she learned another piece of information, and, well, it wasn't that, it was this. And the plot would reverse so many times during the show, and it wasn't until you got to the end of the show and they knew the whole story, all of the visible and invisible elements, that everything made sense, and then, remarkably, the spirit of the person who had died could move on to whatever dimension of being followed. And it was always portrayed as something light and beautiful and wonderful. The only ones that were portrayed as negative, I think, were people who were specifically trying to do something bad or oppressive or go in some negative direction, which, of course, those were never the people who contacted her. She was always there to help someone who really wanted things to work out right. But the thing that made every show so fascinating is just that you didn't know how it was going to end until you got the whole story, until you saw all of the visible parts and all the invisible parts. In each thing you had perhaps a grain of sand, and a grain of sand by itself didn't make any sense. And it wasn't until you added that grain of sand to a whole lot of other grains of sand that it began to make sense what you were looking at. One of the things I did in the past to me, to back up a little bit, I start with the belief that everything is alive in some sense of the word. And then I understand that I'm here for a limited amount of time, that I do everything I can while there's time, because at some point my life is going to run out and I won't have any more time. And I'm sure when that time comes that there will still be more things that I wanted to do and more things that I wanted to create, and I will just have run out of time. Because of that, however, when I collect things, it's not because I want to own things, it's because each of these things is a piece of my story. And so when these things are taken from me or stolen from me, or I release them, it's as if a loved one is going away. And if they're stolen, then it's as if my child has been stolen from me and taken, and it leaves a hole that I can never fill, because I don't know where they are or what happened to them, if they were happy or if they're not. In some cases, on the other hand, when I lost my house and I knew that I did not have the ability to provide for all of my possessions any longer, and I had established emotional relationships with a number of things there, and I had this collection of stuffed animals on my bed, penguins and creatures and lions and bears and all sorts of different things. And when I tried to understand, what do we do? Our world is falling apart. No one is coming to help. No one is willing to keep you for me. And I don't have the ability to take you with me. And I don't want you being lost in a way that could potentially be bad. I don't want to leave my child at the mall or outside of town or whatever. And who knows what happens? Who knows whether things go well for them or go badly? And because of all that, I chose to look at each of these creatures, remind them of my love, and embrace them and kiss them and bless them. And then I gathered them all in a big group, and I commissioned them to greater works. And I gave them to a domestic violence shelter, so that when a woman or a man might come to that shelter and have children in tow who didn't understand what was happening in the adult world around them, and they were disoriented and they needed to feel loved and they needed something to hang on to, that the staff at that domestic violence shelter could give them one of my stuffed animals and say, here's a lion for you to hang on to, here's a teddy bear for you to take care of, here's a penguin that needs you as much as you need him. And in having that stuffed animal, each of the beings that had lived with me could now go and be a ministry to someone else, that they could go to these places where need was experienced and be a loving, helping presence. And I commissioned them to that work, and with prayer and meditation, and then gave them to that domestic violence shelter so that they could do some good that I would not be able to directly do myself, because I knew I couldn't hang on to them, so I at least wanted to be sure that they went somewhere good. And they were kind of a sand in the whole story, and each of the things I had was a piece of a larger story. And when I hang on to these things, it's not because I'm just sentimentally attached, it's because in some sense this thing is alive, and being alive, I need to love it and respect it and treat it like the Velveteen Rabbit, that with enough love they become real in a way that transcends their mere physical form. And so when they're stolen from me, I feel like a child has been stolen. And in a similar sort of way, I went on a trip once with someone, and we found some very fine sand there. And the person thought I was out of my mind, I'm sure, but I decided I want something to remind me of that experience and to take me back to that moment anytime I need to remember it. And so I gathered a huge amount of sand. And my plan, which you now have in front of you, was eventually to create an hourglass. This hourglass is actually made from 2 wine bottles, because I tried for years and I could not find anyone willing to make the glass for me. So I had to engineer my own hourglass out of whatever I could find. So I took 2 wine bottles And the goofy thing is that we couldn't find anyone willing to drink the wine because to me all alcohol tastes bitter, and so I don't drink any alcohol. But I needed the bottles, so I bought the bottles and we had to dispose of the wine and say thank you anyway. And then I used the bottles to create this hourglass, and it is filled with sand. Since I built this, the sand has never been outside of that hourglass. Never been outside those bottles. It moves from one side to another, back and forth and back and forth. It is in motion, but when the sand all runs through, then it becomes stagnant, and there is potential, but there's nothing happening. There's no life. And so for me to have a life with this memory, I need to turn it upside down from time to time. The very idea of turning something upside down, that it's not about maintaining a nice balanced form. It's about, the only way this works is if I turn it upside down from time to time, if I completely reverse it. And sometimes in our own lives, that is equally the dynamic that needs to happen. That if we always do what we've done, nothing will happen that hasn't already happened. When we want something new to happen in our lives, when we want a new growth or new development or a new sense of self, we have to do something we've never done. We have to turn things upside down and mix them around and see how they move, and understand that every grain of sand, every moment that went into that, the moment I gathered the sand, the moment I finally created the hourglass out of wine bottles because I couldn't find anyone willing to make the hourglass form, and I wasn't willing to wait any longer, that I was patient to a point, but not beyond a point. There was some patience, but not an excessive amount of patience that would allow me to slip into stagnation. But then, of course, I had to test it and make sure that I made the hole just the right size so that the sand would flow and would behave the way an hourglass should. And then I had to figure out what I put between the two bottles to create exactly that flow and no more. Because if I didn't put anything in there, then of course it would flow too fast and be over in a few seconds. In this case, I wanted a hole that would not clog, but I didn't want a hole too big, and so that's where I made it the way I did. And all of that is all kinds of physical background stuff, but the thing that makes it real for me, and the thing that makes it a sentimental object that I hang on to, and a story that continues to speak to me, is that I know where the sand came from, I know what the experience was, and I know everything that went into making it happen, all the struggle involved in creating this hourglass. And in a similar sort of way, all the people that come into our lives are individual grains of sand, and there's a myriad of them that will pass through our lives throughout the time that we have. And each one is in a sequence, and it's not unimportant, because if every grain of sand wasn't in there, the hourglass wouldn't work. If only one grain of sand was in there, the hourglass wouldn't work. It is specifically by coming together and acting in solidarity and acting as a unit, as a whole, acting together and taking turns of going through the tiny hole between the two halves, that all the sands are able to measure time and create an experience, a dynamic, moving experience that would not otherwise exist. If we had to do it all, if one person had to do it all alone, it wouldn't happen. One grain of sand would fall through, you couldn't even see it, and nothing would be measured, nothing would matter. By being a group together and working together and allowing each one to take a turn, this experience of measuring time happens. And it happens very slowly, but it does happen. And it's not that it happens slow or fast, because whether it's slow or fast is only in comparison to what you're comparing it to. It happens more quickly than something fossilizes, but it happens more slowly than the second hand on my watch. It's, in a sense, it's relative, but each of these different things measures different things. What this measures is not only the time that it runs, but also the way that that experience remains for me, an experience that affects my ongoing life. There is a sense in which what is seen is not all there is. When somebody looks at this, they see an hourglass. They see sand running through, they see a particular color of sand. They don't know where it came from. They don't know why I chose to make it purple. They don't know how long it takes. They don't know what the relationship between the grains of sand within the hourglass is. They don't know how long it's been since any of those grains of sand were exposed to air outside of the bottles which form the hourglass shape that they're in. And as much as the cone of sand in the bottom looks like it did every other time, it's not the same, because every single cone of sand that is formed is a different combination. Every single time there is a different grain of sand that is at the top. I was thinking the other day about pyramids and how it's kind of a pyramidal shape, and I was told that the reason pyramids are the shape they are is because it's exactly the angle that mound of sand is forming inside the bottle. That's exactly the same angle as you have on a pyramid. That is just the way sands form. In thinking about pyramids the other day, it occurred to me that you have big stones at the top and small and larger stones at the bottom, and that each one is designed according to its place to do different things. There are a lot of people who want to think of themselves as the top of the pyramid, not realizing that the top of the pyramid is a very small stone that may actually not be that strong. It may be very weak. The strongest stones are the ones at the bottom, and in many cases they're the largest ones also, because they have the entire weight of the pyramid sitting on top of them, and they're able to hold it up. So in that sense, when you say that what is seen is not all there is, when you go to a company and you ask to meet the company, you're always met by the receptionist and the person who runs the company. You're not met by the person who works on the line, who maintains the lawn, who does the menial, who empties the waste baskets, who does the menial stuff around the factory. They are the foundation stones that keep the factory functioning. And if you doubt me on that, then I would encourage you to go to a factory and remove all of those people and see how well the place still works. I don't think it's going to work very well, because it still comes down to this basic point. For example, when I worked as a night clerk for the shipping department of Swiss Colony in southern Wisconsin, immediately after my high school years, and at the end of the season, the foreman commented that I was the only, they called it scheduled clerk, because essentially my job was to prepare a report of how many things had been shipped during that 8-hour shift. Each hour, how many things went out on the line, how many of this, how many of that, and then submit that report to each of the manager's desks before I left, which was like 7 or 8 desks. And he said during that season I was the only one who had not made a single mathematical error, which I took as a very high compliment. But the point of it, though, was that none of those managers would have even had a job if it wasn't for every single person working on the lines, putting things in boxes and shipping them out. The real people that kept the factory going were the people who worked on the lines. It wasn't the people who sat in the offices and didn't do anything. And each of those people, in order to work there, had to have a place to call home, because this was in southern Wisconsin. And one of the other things I remember about going to that job is that I would ride there on my bicycle. And of course, being in Wisconsin, working from essentially, approximately September through, I think, early January, maybe the late December. I think it was early January. It was a Wisconsin winter, and I don't know how many people know what that means, but the average temperature in January when I was a child was minus 25, because of course this was before global warming. And so I would have to go from my house to there on my bicycle, because I didn't have a car at the time, and I would essentially run out the door, jump on my bike, and pedal as fast as I could. It was only about a mile away, but in that time the air was so cold that my eyes would start to hurt, my eyes would water so that I could hardly see where I was going by the time I got to the factory and rushed inside the building again. And that's what I did in order to earn the little money that I did from that night job. But having that home, having a place to come back to that was warm, that was shelter, that was my base of operations. And only because I had that base of operations could I even apply for that job in the first place? There's a horrendous number of jobs that one cannot get unless you can name a particular address and identify yourself legally. Every employer wants to know on their application form, on their employment form, where do you live, where do you work, how long have you lived there, etc. So you have to put down your name and your address. And the only ones I think who are exceptions to that would be the day labor places. And those generally only exist in large cities, not in small towns. I grew up in a small town, so there was no day labor place. If you didn't have an address, you couldn't have employment. If you didn't have employment, you couldn't have a home. One ties so much in the other, and that's where I come back to saying the world is a shared space. And what makes it work is when we make sure that it works for everyone, when it's all inclusive, when it's not just I'm worried about myself and I don't care about anybody else. I have to worry about everybody else because my ability to survive is equally dependent upon their ability to survive. And so it's not because I approve of everything they do or everything they are. It's because whether or not I approve, they have to be there. And I try to encourage them to be the best and to be a good person and so forth. But ultimately, whether they are as good as me or worse than me or better than me, they have to be there because it takes all of us working together to make the world work. In trying to deal with this issue of home, I guess my own story, going through this relationship where my ex was the breadwinner and I was the homemaker, and we both agreed that I worked harder than he did, but he got paid because his skills were more in demand than mine were. After 9 years of living in his world, I just found I couldn't do it anymore. It wasn't meeting my needs, and I couldn't go more than 9 years with unmet needs. And so I had to leave that situation and find a situation where my needs were met. And that was very, very difficult to do and took quite a while. I did eventually find it, but then I could only hold on to it for 11 years before a mortgage holder took the house because I was in a doctoral program and I was dumped by the school because they didn't know what to do with autism. And they didn't have any professors anymore who were willing to work for me. And that's really quite illegal, but it's not about going after them or naming them or anything else. It's about that being one of my life developments. And at that point, I couldn't find a way to make the mortgage payment, and so I lost the house to a mortgage company. I attempted to buy an old house that nobody wanted. No one had lived in it for 5 years. Nobody wanted it. And to the best of my understanding, it is once again sitting empty because nobody wants it. I could live in it just fine, except that the way the rules have evolved, I'm no longer allowed to live in it. I'm not allowed to live in something of which they do not approve, even though they will not provide housing for me that in place of that, without stripping me of all myself, all my ability to choose, all my ability to say, this doesn't work for me, this does work for me, this is what I need, I don't need you, I don't need that, I do need this. I know my own needs and I know how to survive. If I had been born in the United States 100 years ago, I would have known how to survive because at that time there wasn't this kind of regulation. They threatened me in all sorts of ways and wouldn't allow me to live in this house they didn't want, that no one had lived in for 5 years and that no one is living in now. So I had to leave. And I tried another one in a different state, the same sort of thing. It was a house that it's actually the only time in my life where for a year and a half I lived in a house that had everything I needed, everything. And I was able to make it work, and I was able to provide for myself. I was even able to pay the property taxes on a regular basis. It was wonderful. The one reason I couldn't stay there, and the house is now sitting empty like it was before, is because the people who ran the town didn't approve. It's all speculation. I think on one level they were concerned that I was fixing the house up to a better state than the houses they lived in. And I would have been glad to help them also, but they didn't ask me to. They wanted me gone, and so they came up with a rule and applied it arbitrarily without having to enforce it with anything, which in that particular state they didn't have to enforce it because I tried appealing to people at the state level and no one would advocate for me. So I had a house, it was completely paid for, it was mine, I was living in it, everything was taken care of, except I didn't have their permission. And which is where we come back to all the struggles that have happened since then, because the house is once again sitting empty. Nobody wants it, but they won't allow me to live in it because I haven't satisfied their permission to be, they want someone more normal than I am. And the wonderful thing I found about homes when I was growing up in southern Wisconsin was that you could live in whatever you wanted to. You could call home whatever you wanted to. And the unwritten rule of thumb was that, quote, your nose stops at my property line. What our neighbors did was entirely up to them. They could do whatever they wanted to as long as they did it on their own property. Where this comes down to the present is remembering that the fundamental goal is that everyone have a home. And from that point, to encourage them to develop a trade or a profession or something that allows them to reach out and interact with their community in a symbiotic fashion. They provide something for their community, and their community provides something for them. And when they have money, they spend it, and they pay a little sales tax, and when they have income, they pay a little income tax. But in the meantime, they're not rendered homeless. They have a place of home, and they have some place from which to try to satisfy all the demands made upon them.